So yesterday we did the Americas team building tier list. Today we're going to do the EMEA team building tier list. Now again, this is based off what I think would be their ideal from where they ended last year to what they've done so far. And we're going to start here with our first team, Gentle Mates, the Ascension winning team who have just kept their team together. And those will be the 5. And you know, I really can't say too much about this. They haven't played in any off-season tournaments. The last game they played was their win in the EMEA Ascension Grand Final over Apex. They haven't done anything since that. And there's really not much to say because, of course, these players earned their way into Tier 1, so you keep them. And so for Gentlemates, I'm going to put them in the A tier because I think that that's perfectly fine. The only thing I would say is I wish they would have played in some of these off-season tournaments just to give us an idea of, you know, how things are going. But that seems like it's not going to happen. Next up is Karmine Corps, which is a very interesting team who very recently just announced what their roster will be. It's this: Magnum, Tomazi, Narrate, Martine, and Shin, which is a real kind of interesting mix of players. We got players who were playing in Tier 2 EMEA last year, like Tomazi, Martine. Magnum, of course, was with Apex, but many of you will know Magnum from his time on Fnatic. We had Shin, who was currently on the team already. Then you bring in Narrate from Mad Lions, from NA. It's a really kind of interesting mix. And then you've got Eng, the old Gambit coach, as the head coach. So it's very, very different to what Karmine Corps was. Obviously, many of you will know the disaster that was Karmine Corps last year. They did manage to win a couple of games, but it obviously was kind of a mess from top to bottom, and they've just gone in a very, very different direction. And I like this direction. I think this is the way teams probably should build teams, right? Start with a bunch of young players, see who's good. The ones that you don't think are that good, get rid of them the next year and bring in other players that you think might be good, and you just keep going until you end up with like a Fnatic-like roster where everyone is just really good. And so for Karmine Corps, I like the approach. Will this team be absolutely amazing and dominate league? Probably not. I would still say they probably will finish in the bottom half, but at least they have something to build on. You know, they needed to make changes. They did make those changes, and so I'm going to put them in the A tier. Now on to Koi, who have made a couple changes themselves. They have let go of Wolfen and called them Mentor, and they've brought in Shadow and Camo from EMEA Tier 2, and they've kept Starkso, Shados, and Trex. Now, keeping Starkso, Shados, and Trex, I think, makes sense, particularly for the latter two, right? I think they absolutely are clearly Tier 1 level players and absolutely deserve their spot. Making a couple changes, I think, is also was clearly needed. This team drastically underperformed. I mean, I thought that Koi were going to be a very good team kind of last year, but it just all fell apart. Nothing really worked for them at all going through that season. So it'll be interesting to see how this roster does this time. I know Shadow from Apex, right? Pretty much everyone, I think, from Apex is now in Tier 1. Camo, I'm not as familiar with, but it looks like he's probably going to be their duelist player. They haven't played in a ton of off-season tournaments. There's just this one kind of Crossfire Cup versus Cathay Esports where they did play their starting 5 players and they actually lost 3-2 to a Tier 2 Spanish team. So maybe not the greatest start in the world for this roster, but at least they have made some necessary changes. And so for Koi, I'm going to put them in the B tier. I'm glad they've made some changes, but I'm just not willing to trust this team yet after getting burned last year. Okay, now on to Team Heretics, who made a ton of changes from where they were last year. This is their starting 5 right now. They kind of bring in Benji Fishy. They brought him in towards the end of last year, but you know, now he's here to stay. They bring in Rienz and Woot. Woot, by the way, Doombro says, is the future. So keep that in mind. And they bring in Boo's brother, Mini Boo. So basically from the actual like full-time roster last year, they only keep Boo. They make 4 changes. And a lot of these players are very young players, right? So they're bringing in new young talent. They keep the coaching staff the same. And again, I like this approach. I think that this is a correct approach for teams to have. Bringing in fresh, young, new talent, you know, and seeing if they're any good. Seeing if they can crack it at this level. And then you go from there, right? I think that that's the way these teams, particularly teams who struggled mightily last year, that's the way you want to go about it. And so, you know, and then from this time next year, hopefully it goes better for Heretics, and then they can, you know, just keep the players who did well. You know, maybe you move on from those who didn't do as well, and you see how it goes. And so for Heretics, I'll put them in the A tier as well. I like the approach, and if Woot is the future, then maybe Heretics will be better than people expect. Okay, now on to BBL, and if we look at their transactions, they've made a couple changes. They let go of their coach. They let go of Turco as well. They brought in Loris, Elite, and they went for the old classic, if I can find it, the old minus Pora plus Pora. you know, which is always a fun one. And so this is their roster now. Now, they've only played in one show match, and in that show match, they played with the 5 without Aslan. I'm not sure if that's confirmed that that's what the roster will be, but maybe that is the case. As I said, they haven't played in a ton of off-season tournaments either, so I guess we'll have to see exactly what the roster looks like. But they're sticking with the old Turkish stuff, making a couple changes, and we'll see how it goes. And so for BBL, my main concern with them is not even necessarily the players they brought in, but who they didn't bring in, right? Because CNED was sitting out there as a Turkish talent. And then also Foot let go of Kiwi as another amazing Turkish talent that they didn't get. And I just feel like, you know, those are two players who have clearly proven themselves at the tier 1 level. And instead they have a team that I'm just not sure if they'll actually be good enough to really compete at the highest levels. Okay, now on to Team Vitality, who have made quite a few changes themselves here. They've got a massive coaching staff. Look at all that. But Bonecold is inactive, and obviously they bring in Safe, they bring in Runner, they bring in Kicks, they keep Destrian and Sender as the 2 players that were already on the roster. And it's a very different looking team. And I'm not super familiar with Kicks. I know that Runner is a pretty decent player, and of course we all know that Safe is a really good player. So that's a good start to just begin with. And yeah, this team obviously was kind of an interesting team last year, right? Like, did okay, had flashes, but wasn't maybe really consistent, you know, and couldn't kind of break through that barrier of going to an international tournament. I think you add a player like Safe in there, right? One of the best players in EMEA, that's definitely going to be like a big boost in terms of, you know, trying to break through that glass ceiling. And so I kind of like the direction of, you know, adding in young tier 2 talent, add in a really good player like Safe. Seems like a decent idea. And now we haven't seen Vitality compete yet as I'm doing this video, but they will be playing in a tournament very soon. But I like what they've done here, right? I think that this is pretty good. And honestly, I think Safe is good enough where you would actually put Vitality in the S tier. Now on to Foot, who have made a couple changes themselves. They let go of Moj and Kiwi and brought in Yetajay and CNED. Now, we have seen Foot play in a couple off-season tournaments, and it does look like Yetajay is a very, very strong player. So that seems like a very good pickup. Obviously, CNED, everyone knows at this point, and he's obviously a very good player. The only thing I would say is you've let go of Kiwi, who is also a terrific player. And it's just kind of my opinion here that, you know, roles maybe aren't as important as people think, right? I think Paper Rex are a good proof of that, right? You can have a team that has, you know, Jing just playing Raze all the time, something on Jet as well, you know, and make it work. So that's always been my opinion, that at this point in the game, you can still make it work and just get good players and you'll make it work. And that's unfortunate that Kiwi had to leave, but I mean, they did pick up CNED, so obviously that's pretty good. And Yetajay, as I said, does look like a very strong player. And so for that, I'm gonna put Foot in the A tier. The only thing bringing them down is I like Kiwi, and I think it's sad that such a talented player is playing in tier 2, but that is the way of the world. But still a very good offseason for Foot. Okay, now on to Giants Gaming, who were forced to make one change. They had to get rid of their IGL Ryan because he retired, and they bring in Redgar, obviously a familiar figure to everyone here, and tier 1 is just better with Redgar in it, you know, and it would have been a shame to not have his face be in tier 1, right? No matter what you think about some of his plays or whatever, it's just fun to have him here. And so I'm glad that he is. Now, Giants haven't played in a ton of off-season tournaments. They did play in that aforementioned Crossfire Cup with some of the Spanish teams, and they did win that tournament, right? So that's already like a good start for them. You know, that they seem to be on the right page. Of course, Giants were a pretty good team last year, so keeping it together, letting this team kind of work together a bit more. Obviously, they were forced to make one change, but you pick up an experienced IGL. You know, it seems like a pretty decent idea for Giants. And so for that, I'm going to put Giants in the A tier again. I mean, I know that some of you might think that Redgar maybe wasn't the best choice for them or whatever, but as I said, it's good to have Redgar in tier 1 for the scene. Okay, now moving on to Team Liquid, who we recently saw in the AVL, and of course they made a couple changes themselves, bringing in Mystic, Kaiko, and Enzo. Quite a big change, really, from where they were. They keep Yampi and Nets, and they keep their coaching staff as well. And the thing is with this team, and I've mentioned this before, and I think we kind of saw that play out at the Africa tournament as well, where I actually think the average of this team will be about the same as where the team was last year, but just with probably, you know, lower highs but higher lows, if you get what I mean. A lower ceiling and a higher floor. That's kind of what I see for this team. Less up and downs, but probably about the same, right? Kind of in that 3rd to 4th best EMEA team. you know, maybe make it to a couple tournaments. Could definitely see it. Yampy and Nats, of course, very good. The other 3 players from Apex they picked up, you know, Enzo and Mystic have experienced, you know, the high-level competitions or whatever. Kaiko's a good young duelist. Like, it all kind of makes sense. But whilst it all does make sense, I'm not convinced that they've really improved the roster. I think they've just got a more steady roster, which is fine, but I think that means that they're probably in the B tier. Okay, now on to NaVi, who only made one change. They let go of CNED, and they bring back Artis, the old minus Artis plus Artis. And there really isn't much to say. We saw NaVi play in the Riot 1 Pro Invitational. They did pretty well in that tournament. You know, they beat down on some teams that you'd probably expect them to beat. And yeah, they looked perfectly fine. And well, there's really only one thing to say with NaVi, which is they have Angel and Artis together again, which is pure content. And so for that alone, I have to put NaVi in the S tier, because it's like you've got Angel and Artis back together. So into the S tier you go. Okay, now on to Fnatic, and obviously they kept the same team. I know it's a shock. I know you won't believe it, but they did. They kept the same 5. Who could believe that? But of course, Mini did, you know, leave the team of his own accord, and they brought in Elmer Putty, who, you know, it was a bit out of left field, right? I don't think many people expected Elmer Putty to come from Gen G all the way to Fnatic. It's a bit, you know, of an interesting change, but we'll see how he does. I guess, obviously, this team will be expected to win things again, will probably be the favorite for, you know, most of the early tournaments, to say at the least. And so for Fnatic, I mean, I guess I'll just put them in B tier. What else do you expect them to do, really? I guess. And so this is the thing, right? A lot of teams, you don't have to troll the off-season, right? And this is the off-season. It's the time of hope. So this is why you get a lot of teams in the S and A tiers, right? And it looks more hopeful for a lot of teams. But then again, I feel like a lot of the teams in the EMEA just did kind of decent moves. But stay tuned for Pacific tomorrow, where maybe some teams didn't make all necessarily good moves.